There is no doubt that most police officers are honest and strive to be ethical in all they do. However, examples of corruption and graft in law enforcement agencies are not difficult to find. Let's take a look at police corruption and responses. For our purposes, we divide misconduct into two broad categories: economic corruption and abuse of authority. Economic corruption can be defined as the use of one's position to obtain improper financial benefit. Abuse of authority is when the power and authority of the office is misused. Even though there's a large body of literature on police corruption, few studies have been able to measure its extent and prevalence. An obvious barrier to discovery is getting police officers to admit the wrongdoing. One early study reported, by officers' own accounts, 39% is the number engaged in illegal uses of force, 22% perjured themselves, 31% had sex on duty, and 8% drank while on duty, and 39% slept while on duty. Before one can begin to research prevalence, it would be necessary to have some shared understanding of a definition of corruption. Here are some types of misconduct: profit-motivated crimes, off-duty crimes against persons, and off-duty public order crimes, as well as drugs. Other forms of misconduct include on-duty abuse, obstruction of justice, administrative failure to perform, and conduct-related probationary failures. To promote effectiveness and ethics, it's important to understand the typology of economic corruption and abuse of authority. Corruption has been described as acting on opportunities created by one's authority for personal gain at the expense of the public one is authorized to serve. Gratitudes are items of value received by an individual because of his or her role or position rather than because of a personal relationship with the giver. The widespread practices of free coffee in convenience stores, half-price or free meals in restaurants, and half-price dry cleaning are examples of gratitudes. Justifications for gratitudes include the idea that some businesses need extra protection, that they're no different than the perks of other occupations, and that they compensate for poor pay, and they only cement community relations. Research indicates that people do not support gratitudes, but do not think they're very serious either, especially when the items were infrequent, food, or inexpensive. Critics of gratitudes argue that they erode public confidence in law enforcement and undermine our quest for professionalism. Critics argue against gratitudes for the following reasons: professionals don't take gratitudes, gratitudes are grounds for corruption, and gratitudes are an abuse of authority. Additionally, critics argue that gratitudes add up to substantial amounts, they're the beginning of more serious forms of corruptions, they're contrary to democratic ideals, and they create a public perception that police are corrupt. Where should one draw the line between harmless rewards and inappropriate gifts? Suppose that an officer is told by a convenience store owner that he or she can help him or herself to anything in the store: free coffee, candy, cigarettes, chips, magazines, and the like. In the same conversation, the store owner asks the officer for her personal cell phone number in case something happens and I need to get in contact with you. Is this a gift or is it an exchange? Free meals or even coffee may influence the pattern of police patrol and thus may be wrong because some citizens are not receiving equal protection. The blue discount suit was a term that indicated how officers felt about gratitudes, explaining how officers expected merchants to extend free merchandise with the saying, "If you got no pop, you got no cop." Graft is the exploitation of one's role by accepting bribes or protection money. Examples of graft involve a range of seriousness from cheating a little on overtime to sophisticated schemes that utilize police power for private gain. Abuse of authority involves officers' misuse of the power and authority inherent in their positions. Police abuse of authority can be summarized as follows: physical abuse, including excessive force and physical harassment; psychological abuse, including disrespect, ridicule, and excessive stops; and legal abuse, including unlawful searches and seizures, manufacturing evidence, and perjury. One practice not included is the typology called professional courtesy, which refers to the practice of not ticketing an officer who is stopped for speeding or other violations. Obviously, officers do not ticket everyone they stop. They often give warnings instead, and that's a legitimate use of their discretion. Whether to give a ticket or a warning should depend on objective criteria. If the officer would let another person go with a warning in the same situation, then there's no ethical issue of giving another officer a warning. Regardless of the situation, justifications for not ticketing other officers are diverse and creative. Officers who are stopped for driving while intoxicated are sometimes driven home rather than arrested, but this application of discretion is less likely to be afforded to any other citizen. Officers who believe that they should not have to follow the same laws they enforce against others may be more prone to other forms of abuse and authority as well. One step more serious than not ticketing an officer or anyone solely for preferential reasons is fixing a ticket that's already been written. Sexual harassment of fellow officers is also another problem prevalent in the community. The most extremely serious side of misconduct is usually associated with the drug trade and involves officers who cross over into being more criminal than cop. We've examined a range of corruption, from the arguably trivial to criminal acts that include murder. The costs of these issues to communities are considerable. Police officers sometimes don't even know when the city settles because it's a decision made by city officials outside the police department. Police officers believe that city lawyers are too quick to settle insurance claims and the officer is not at fault. However, when such cases go to trial, there's a risk of a much larger judgment. The important point to note is that civil lawsuits seem to be independent from the department's own discipline system, and rarely if there's a mechanism to note when officers become the target of lawsuits multiple times. These factors then provide an avenue for how to reduce misconduct. It is important to note that on the onset, there is rarely only one factor or group of factors responsible for corruption scandals. Generally, a number of factors are present. The most common explanation for police officer corruption is the rotten apple argument, that the officer alone is deviant and that there was simply a mistake to hire him or her into the department. This argument has been extended to describe rotten bushels, groups of officers banding together to commit deviant acts. The point of this argument is that there's nothing wrong with the barrel. The deviance is the individual, not an epidemic. Police routinely deal with the seamier side of society, not only drug addicts and muggers, but also middle-class people who are involved in dishonesty and corruption. The constant displays of lying, hiding, cheating, and theft create cynicism, and this, in turn, may develop into a vulnerability to temptation because officers may redefine corrupt acts as acceptable behaviors. The following are some rationales that police might use to justify unethical behavior. The public thinks every cop is a crook, why not try? If I don't take it, someone else will. I'm only taking what's rightfully mine. I can use it because it's for a good cause. Various elements of the organization can breed misconduct. Organizational factors that affect ethical behavior include small workgroup influences. These small workgroups are exemplified by special units and narcotic task forces. There seems to be a pattern in news stories of these small workgroups developing a microculture of unethical behavior. Organizational incentives may also encourage unethical behavior. Both the formal culture and the informal culture may generate deviance. Research reveals that close supervision, especially by mid-level managers such as sergeants, reduces the use of force and incidents of misconduct by officers. Some argue that lax community standards over certain types of behavior, like gambling or prostitution, and lack of support from prosecutors and the courts, or corruption at that stage of the system, lead to police corruption. Police hear mixed messages from the public regarding certain types of crime. They are asked to enforce laws against gambling, pornography, and prostitution, but not too stringently. They are expected not only to enforce laws against drunk driving, but also be tolerant of individuals who really aren't very criminal. They are expected to uphold laws regarding assault unless a family or interpersonal dispute that disrupts a personal life may settle it privately. In other words, we want police to enforce the law unless they enforce it against us. The point is that, to a large degree, the community creates the police department by what it demands and what it's willing to overlook. For our purposes, we divide misconduct into two broad categories: economic corruption and abuse of authority. Rotten apple approaches to reducing misconduct focus on the individual officer. There is an assumption that if an officer or officers are found to be deviant, the wrong person was hired and there needs to be better training or better monitoring and discipline. Background checks, interviews, credit checks, polygraphs, drug tests, and other screening tools are used to eliminate inappropriate individuals from the pool of potential hires. The extent of screening varies from department to department, but generally has become more sophisticated, especially in the use of psychological testing and interviews. Education has been promoted as necessary as an element to improve the ethics of policing, and research does show that educated officers were less likely to be terminated. However, many of the unethical officers described in these courses have been to college and are college graduates. Ethics training in the academy and in service occurs. It's common and recommended for all police departments today. The International Association of Chiefs of Police in 2008 found that about 80% of reporting agencies said they committed resources to ethics instruction, although most courses simply employed lectures and were 4 hours or less. Integrity testing occurs when a police officer is placed in a position where he or she may be tempted to break a rule or a law and monitored to see what he or she will do. Early warning systems look at a number of complaints, use of force reports, use of weapons reports, reprimands, or other indicators to identify officers. Police departments have increasingly purchased and equipped their officers with body-worn cameras. Video has been an incredibly powerful tool to support allegations of brutality and abuse of authority. Officers now are beginning to use cameras too. They are increasingly supportive of body cameras as studies establish that citizens' behavior improves when they know they're being filmed, and camera footage helps officers defend themselves against false charges of misconduct. Many people simply do not trust police departments to root out individuals who should not have the power and authority inherent in the position. One response in recent years has been for individuals or groups to construct databases of wrongful actions. Organizational explanations address elements of the police organization, including such things as improving investigation and disciplinary procedures. In one sense, the internal affairs model is also a rotten apple approach to reducing corruption, since the model provides the mechanism whereby the department investigates and punishes the officer. Unfortunately, internal affairs units are perceived as ineffective by the public and biased by police officers. Some departments have enlarged the mission of internal affairs to become anti-corruption units. These units, especially in other countries, now undertake the mission of not only investigation and punishment, but also deterrence and prevention. The civilian review model has a board of civilian or civilian and police members who monitor and review internal investigations and discipline of officers. Creating or strengthening a civilian review board is often on the list of mandated charges in consent decrees. There is strong support for allowing residents some access and input into how police departments police themselves. If the police culture influences a level of police misconduct, it's important to change that culture. Changing the culture in a police department requires addressing elements of the subculture, for example, the blue curtain of secrecy. Improving leadership is an essential element in improving the ethical climate of any organization. Research shows that supervisors shape the attitude of line officers towards wrongdoing. When misconduct is punished, it is perceived as more serious. If it's treated lightly, the opposite occurs. It's difficult to conceive how society can affect police corruption. However, it's possible that this is the most important part of the discussion. Let's take a look. Civil rights cases against police officers are rare. In one newspaper investigation using nearly 3 million caseload records, it was found that U.S. attorneys declined 96% of civil rights cases against officers between 2005 and 2015. Consent decrees are mandated reforms approved by a federal judge with a court-appointed monitor to oversee progress. The order includes changes in policies or procedures. It may require hiring more officers and/or increasing training efforts. In response to the Black Lives Matter movement and other protests, President Barack Obama created the Task Force on Policing in the 21st Century, composed of a mix of academics and police professionals. The panel's report was met with hostility by many police groups who perceived the process as anti-police. However, it's important to note that the 21st Century panel on policing included police leaders as well as members of the public, aided by experts. The report makes it clear that police officers' discretion must be guided by a strong understanding of their purpose and an ethical code. All of us act as external stakeholders to police practices. There's a correction effect that occurs when the public becomes aware of problems. One thing that is not helpful is to paint police as evil or brutal or any other adjective. It is certainly not the case that, just because there are issues in Chicago or Baltimore, every community has police forces with problems. It is important to revisit the reason why we should revere and respect all police officers who voluntarily enter a profession where they offer their lives to save others.